Greetings all, and welcome to the Buddha's Invitation. Today, we're going to tell the story of Angulimala. Now, that's a person, and his name in English is Finger Garland, or Finger Necklace, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. It's found in the 86th Sutta of the Majjhima Nikaya, that is the Middle Length Discourses of the Buddha. I'll put a link online. You should definitely read this. It's not long. It's going to be much better to read it than, my retelling will not capture all of the nuances or the beauty. And one other thing, this story, this is the story as it's found in the Pali Canon. Now, either in the commentary or in maybe some sort of Mahayana tradition or the Tibetan tradition, you'll hear this story told with much more backstory on Angulimala. And that's interesting, and I need to try to remember, I'd like to talk about that at the end of this video. But to a certain extent, it's not that it isn't relevant, but it's not extremely important. And I will let you, it's not, again, I'll let you judge that. But what I'm trying to say is, whatever Angulimala's past was, this story, it will make sense no matter what. So, without any further ado, this story, again, is about Angulimala. Now, it is told in the Sutta that he was living in the kingdom of Kosala, and that was King Pasenadi, and or the king of which was King Pasenadi. And we're told that Angulimala is a murderous, violent person who not only kills individuals, but he's laid waste to entire villages. And, just has no restraint, bloodthirsty. When he kills someone, he will cut off their finger and wear it as a trophy. So he has this big necklace of fingers. Fairly brutal image there. So one day, the Buddha, after going for alms and sitting, and thinking, it's not explicitly said in the Sutta, but something that the Buddha does, or it's said, I've read this in Lily de Silva, that the Buddha would turn his attention in the morning to someone who needed his help. So he decided he would go see Angulimala. And as he's walking down this stretch of road where Angulimala is, like in the forest or something, all these people are telling him, no, recluse, you can't go. This is super dangerous. And they, tell him once, twice, three times, but the Buddha just goes in silence. So then Angulimala sees the Blessed One. And he's ecstatic because he thinks, I can kill 10 people at a time, He said, this is going to be great. This is easy. And he starts to run after the Buddha. And then in the Sutta, all we know is that the Buddha performs some superhuman feat, some kind of mental, I hate to say trickery, but he does something whereby Angulimala, though he's running as fast as he cannot catch up with the Buddha, who is simply walking. And this kind of amazes him, because he thinks, I can outrun the swiftest chariot. I can outrun wild beasts. So he calls out to the Buddha, and he says, hey, stop. And the Buddha, while walking, he says, Angulimala, I have stopped. You should stop too. And Angulimala thinks, these recluses, they usually tell the truth, but he's not stopped walking. So he asks him, he says, what do you mean? And the Buddha says, I have stopped forever violence towards all living beings, but you have not. And at that point, Angulimala's mind and his heart are just completely opened. And he says, finally, someone has come to teach me the Dharma, the teaching. And he basically falls down and he prostrates himself at the Buddha's feet. And he says, please take me on as one of your monks. Let me be one of your followers. So here's the first kind of question. What do you think the Buddha would do? What would you do? And the Buddha, he simply says, come, monk. Kind of beautiful, right? Not, you must go to prison first. You must atone for all of this. Come. So, now, the people of Kosala, they're not real happy, They're kind of scared that this guy's running around killing all kinds of people. And so they go and they're like, King, you got to put an end to this, So the king goes and seeks out the Blessed One, the Buddha. And, maybe to warn him about Angulimala, but also to get some advice, The Buddha was often, kings would come to the Buddha and ask for his advice, his sage wisdom. So he comes, and sees the Buddha there, and with, his monks, or some of his monks, and King Pasenadi is, talking about Angulimala with the Buddha, and the Buddha says, King, what would you do if you found out that Angulimala had become a monk? And this is very interesting. The king says, well, then I would give him, clothing and food and, some of the requisites that monks need. And I think that's very interesting. We would expect maybe the Buddha, being kind of a spiritual person, to simply welcome Angulimala with open arms. But to think that the king also would hold someone, as they say, going into the homeless life, that would hold that, that going forth in such high esteem that he also didn't say, oh, well, he'd have to be punished or, first go to prison or something. So I think that also is really interesting. And then the Buddha says to the king, he says, now, king, don't be alarmed, but you're sitting right next to Angulimala. And of course, monks shave, their head and their eyebrows. So not that there were like pictures of Angulimala, but of course he didn't look like any sort of wild bandit. And the king is a little startled, and the Buddha says, there's nothing to be afraid of. He's renounced, he's really gone forth. And, he's professing to live this life according to Dharma, seeking out, he's on the path to nirvana. And the king, he's amazed at this, and he tells the Buddha, he says, you are someone who can tame with words what we could not tame with weapons and force. So that's kind of another beautiful thing to think about, right? That it's not always going to be violence and force that, or actually maybe maybe violence and force are going to be sort of necessary sometimes for like protection, etc. But they're probably not going to change someone's heart. It takes that teaching. Now, just for the kind of the third part of the story is that not everyone is obviously happy that Angulimala is, not being punished and that he's not in prison. You can imagine if he killed a loved one of yours, a friend, if he'd stolen things from you, etc. So when the monks go out for their alms, there are people who would stand around and, throw branches, throw rocks, and, hurt Angulimala, so that when he would come back from, his alms round, he would just be pretty bloody. And the Buddha would tell him, he says, you just have to endure this. This is this is the karma you created. And that's something else we have to think about, that, and Angulimala did. He did not give in to that. He accepted that as his condition. And that's one of those things that I think is also interesting about the Buddha's teaching, is that even when things are personal, they aren't. Angulimala, he's had this huge change of heart, but they're just these like almost impersonal forces. They're people acting out these impersonal forces, but things just happen. And really, the things that happen to us in life, they're not personal. They're just what happens. And we can't take them as personal. So anyway, I just think that that's a very beautiful story, and it's worth thinking about. Now, one last thing, and I don't remember all the ins and outs of this, but in terms of the Angulimala backstory that you'll hear sometimes, Angulimala was like a spiritual aspirant. He was someone on the spiritual path, and he had a teacher. And this is the part, you can let me know, I just kind of want to fill in a little bit of this, that Angulimala was very, I think, adept. And the other kind of students, disciples of the teacher were pretty jealous. And they got the teacher also I think they told basically a lie about Angulimala, and maybe I'll just leave it at that because I'm not exactly sure. So I think the idea is that the teacher told Angulimala that his path to spiritual liberation was to go kill people, And that is its own cautionary tale, because we see people, of course, we see cults act like this. Cult leaders get people to do, you're kind of in this very vulnerable position, and you're trusting someone, and they tell you to do something horrible, and you think, well, it must not really be that horrible. So I do want to share that. Again, I don't think it's relevant. I think Angulimala's backstory could be anything. He could have just been vicious his whole life, and the story is still beautiful. But this way, it's a little more poignant to think that he was misled into doing something so terrible. But that he finally found his in the Buddha's teaching, he finally found some liberation. So, dear listener, please let me know what you think about that. I hope I didn't ramble on too much. Please do check out the Sutta for yourself. It's not long. And peace.